Talk more about standard norm referenced assessment. Let's talk about creating the assessment, how it's created. And the first thing that the author of one of these assessment instruments needs to do is to identify the what aspect of language, speech or language, does that the author wish the assessment instrument to assess? What does the instrument assess? And what does the author do in making that decision? Well, the author does what you and I do, as we discussed assessment in previous sessions. We have to identify, the author has to identify a paradigm or theoretical base that defines what constitutes language. And you remember, we looked at several different points of view about what language is. The Bloom and Leahy paradigm, for example, we looked at the information processing paradigm, the operant paradigm, remember that? Different points of view, and each point of view revealed aspects of speech and language that could be assessed and that we need to keep in mind, in fact, to assess. So the person who creates, when an instrument is created, the author has to decide, well, what part of speech and language does the instrument measure? What do we want? What do I want? The author would say, what do I want to measure with my instrument? And we, by the way, the consumers of that instrument, as clinicians, have to ask ourselves, what does that instrument actually assess? That's a very good question to ask. So the author has to identify one or more paradigms that define what constitutes language, and then the author has to operationalize the paradigm. That is, once the author selects an approach or a point of view about language and what the author wants to assess with this instrument, you have to figure out, the author has to figure out, well, what am I going to do to extract that information from the client, that behavior that's going to give me the information, and how am I going to measure it? How am I going to make it observable and measurable? So, for example, a paradigm like Bloom and Leahy gives us things to evaluate like content categories or syntactic structures. Well, a content category is a construct. You can't exactly see a content category, can you? That has to be operationalized. And that's typically operationalized by extracting expressive language, having the client speak spontaneously, record the speech, and then analyze it according to a particular category of a quality that the behavior has. So it's the content category is made operational because the client's actual speech and language, that's observable and measurable. Following me? Now, content categories could be one thing that assessment instruments measure in the from the information processing point of view. The instrument would be measuring what? Level of processing, so perception or linguistic things or metalinguistic or executive things, right? Or processes such as memory, discrimination, sequencing, etc., the kinds of things that information processing paradigm reveals. However, those things are constructs again. Executive function can't be seen directly. It has to be reflected in observable, measurable behavior. The author has to figure out a way to get the client to behave in a way that the observable behavior can be analyzed and these things can be identified. Following me? And we clinicians have the responsibility to ask ourselves, what exactly is that assessment instrument measuring? The author says, how do I measure it? We say to ourselves, we ask ourselves, what exactly is this instrument that we're choosing to use with our client? What is it measuring? So the author has to both identify a paradigm and operationalize it. We as clinicians selecting the instrument have to ask ourselves, well, what paradigm did that author employ? And how is the author claiming to be measuring things? And again, that's typically discussed in the administrator manual. Although I strongly recommend that we clinicians not exactly trust the author entirely, but ask our own selves, use our own powers of judgment to decide what the instrument is actually measuring, and is it an appropriate one to use with our client. So again, the author creates items that the client will address in order to, when they operationalize the paradigm, the client's responses to the items yield performance that can be measured and that represent the component of the language. And the author, there are formal ways that the author can go about establishing that they've actually created something that does measure what they claim that it measures. And something the author can do, and in fact must do to publish their test, is to establish validity and reliability of the assessment instrument. We'll be addressing those terms shortly, but the bottom line, does everybody, by the way, remember from their research course or other classes what the terms validity and reliability signify? Validity signifies, does the test assess what it claims to assess? And there are multiple kinds of evidence that will address that question. Does the test assess what it claims to assess? Does everybody know the difference between validity and reliability? Reliability refers to consistency of assessment. That is, if you gave that assessment instrument in the morning on a Monday, would you get the same results that you would get on, say, afternoon on a Thursday, given that it's the same client? That's reliability. Well, there are, again, multiple kinds of evidence of consistency, and in fact more than that kind of consistency. If you're giving a particular section of the test, if you give item number 1, is it of a particular subtest? Does it measure the same kind of thing that, say, item number 3 measures, or item number 29? That's consistency too. So the author must establish validity and reliability, and we clinicians, when we select the instrument, have to explore, have to read that manual, have to use our powers of judgment and analysis to ask ourselves, is this adequate, has validity and reliability been established in an acceptable way, in a way that we can trust? So before choosing an assessment instrument to administer, we should have to, as I just said, evaluate reliability and validity as the consumers of that assessment instrument. And in addition to that, conduct an item analysis to determine exactly what components of language and what levels of information processing are addressed by the assessment instrument. Item analysis signifies that we actually look. We open that test up. We actually open the books up. We open the administration manual up and look item by item and ask ourselves, what do these items mean? The questions that are asked the client, the pictures that are shown, etc. The technique that's used to gather the information. And we ask ourselves, what exactly is this particular item assessing? What are each of these items assessing? Does that correspond to what the author claims the assessment instrument is assessing? And does that meet the client's needs in the assessment? And does it meet my need as a clinician in this assessment?